My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I direct the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard, and I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us. This is a very exciting night for many of us. It is the first in a series and the first annual Courage to Be lecture series at Bard. It's a new series that we're inaugurating this year in conjunction with the college seminar on practices of courage. And it came to be, I'm going to be very brief, but it came to be through conversations between myself and some members of the chaplaincy here at Bard about trying to think about how we could work together to think about moral and ethical curriculum and moral and ethical projects at the college. And we decided that a project exploring how to nurture and think about ethical action through religious and philosophical foundations, with also a social science component as well, would be a fascinating and important project for us. At the same time, some members of the dean and other administrators were talking about trying to imagine a big question college seminar, and these two ideas merged. And so we have this year a pilot program, 4 courses for the first time being taught on a common theme with some shared texts, and these shared dinners. We'll have 3 dinners throughout the semester. Today is the first one. There'll also be one on March 30th with Uday Mehta, and on, I think, April 27th, Jean van Oosnik, who is currently the Harding Fellow over at the Center for Curatorial Studies. So I'm very excited to have you all here. One of the other innovations, and I think very exciting aspects of the Courage to Be program, is that we have 5 student fellows who are involved with all the planning and running of the program. The students helped select the speakers, and we'll be introducing all of our speakers. And so I'm very pleased to introduce tonight one of our student fellows, Marisol Dotard, who will be introducing tonight's speaker. Thanks very much, Marisol.
I was thrilled to be the student fellow picked to introduce and spearhead this evening as soon as I read the first page of Eyal Press's Beautiful Souls. Press, a journalistic writer on the rise, has been featured in several notable publications, including but not limited to The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and very recently, The New York Times. Press has written 2 books. His first book, Absolute Convictions, a tale of the abortion conflict told through the story of his own father, a doctor who faced death threats for his work. Press's second book, and the one the practicum of courage has chosen to focus on, is Beautiful Souls, Saying No, Breaking Ranks, and Being Conscious in Dark Times. Beautiful Souls has been called a hymn to the mystery of disobedience. Press delves into the lives of 4 individuals who had the courage to say no. Instead of theories of evil or abstract notions of courage, Press talks to courageous people and asks them, and himself, what it is about these people that makes them risk their lives and their livelihoods to do what is right. These personal stories are used to shape and clarify the meaning of what it means to be courageous. I am honored and pleased to introduce Eyal Press.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Marisol, and thank you, Bard, for inviting me here. It's really a thrill and an honor to give the first in what I take it will be a series of lectures both this year and in future years about moral courage, which is, as you just heard, something I've written a great deal about and thought a great deal about. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and I will get to some stories, some of the characters in my book, but I'm also going to do a little bit of the sort of heavy thinking type of lecturing before getting to those stories. because the issue of moral and political action is really complicated, and I know you're all taking courses now in various different disciplines that deal with it. So I want to get at some of the hard questions, some of the hard issues, and not just the easy sort of the things we can all agree on. 52 years ago, in 1963, Hannah Arendt published Eichmann in Jerusalem, her seminal account of the trial of the Nazi official Adolf Eichmann. As many of you know, Arendt's book was subtitled A Report on the Banality of Evil, a phrase that doesn't appear in the actual text, but that has since entered popular and scholarly discourse. As Arendt famously concluded in her study, evil acts aren't always perpetrated by abnormal madmen or perverted sadists. They are often carried out by people who are, as she memorably described Eichmann, terrifyingly normal. In the half-century since Arendt's book appeared, the idea that ordinary people thrust into morally compromising circumstances are capable of doing terrible things has become painfully familiar and painfully clear. The idea that equally ordinary people may find their courage when thrust into such circumstances is far less familiar. One reason for this, I think it's safe to assume, is that such people are comparatively rare. There are a lot more people who, in the face of evil and wrongdoing, fall silent and go along than who refuse. But I think another, arguably more important reason is that in the literature on obedience and conformity, a kind of situational reductionism has come to prevail, whereby following malevolent orders is depicted less as a matter of personal choice and volition than as a product of situational pressures. This is the theme of the Stanford psychologist Philip Zimbardo's best-selling book, The Lucifer Effect, which describes the famous experiment in California that Zimbardo oversaw at Stanford University, in which a group of college students were assigned to be guards in a mock prison and given unchecked power over their wards. As those of you familiar with the experiment know, within a few days, these students started mercilessly abusing the volunteers in the experiment who were assigned to be prisoners. Take a group of seemingly decent people, college students, and put them in the wrong situation, Zimbardo argues, and they will soon begin behaving like monsters, irrespective of their character traits. There is no doubt that situational factors do exert a powerful hold over all of us. But I think we should be wary of the claim, which is often made after the fact by perpetrators and their enablers, that those who obey and conform merely did what anyone in their shoes would have, that on account of the circumstances, they had no real choice, which makes it difficult to judge, much less hold accountable, those who invoke this claim. Why should we be wary of this claim? I want to answer this question with a story. Take a look at this picture. As you can see, I hope you can see, pardon me that it comes in the middle of a dinner, it is the picture of a massacre site. The massacre in question took place in Kafr Qasem, a small Arab village in a part of Israel known as the Little Triangle that bordered the West Bank. On October 29, 1956, the first day of the 1956 Suez War, members of Israel's border police were sent to this village to enforce a curfew that was set to begin at 5 p.m. They informed the village headman about the curfew that same afternoon, only an hour or two before it went into effect. which meant that hundreds of Arabs still out working in the fields didn't learn about it in time. When they started returning home later that night, the Israeli border police began dragging them out of their vehicles, lining them up, and shooting them. 49 Arab civilians were killed. Dozens more were injured. It's the largest internal massacre in Israeli history. News of the Kafr Qasim massacre soon trickled out, and sometime later, the perpetrators were brought before an Israeli military court. Their defense rested on the claim that they were carrying out the orders of their superiors, a convenient excuse that happened to be true. Hours before being dispatched to this village, officers from the border police were summoned to a meeting where they were told that the curfew should be enforced without sentiments and that it applied to everyone. If you combine this with the fact that it was the first day of a war and that at the time Arabs in Israel lived under martial law and were seen by many Jewish Israelis as an enemy within, it would seem like a textbook illustration of how situational factors can turn ordinary men into callous perpetrators. But there is one problem with this explanation. The problem is that on the same day, other members of the Israeli border police were sent to neighboring villages with the exact same orders and did not follow them. They too were told to enforce the curfew without sentiments, but they didn't shoot anyone. I did not accept the order, one platoon commander later said. Another said he was planning to accept it until he spoke to the head of the village and changed his mind. Some of the officers who refused testified about this at the trial. Their testimony clearly influenced the judge in the case, who held, in a ruling that is still widely quoted today, that orders which are manifestly illegal not only can be disobeyed, they must be disobeyed. Quote, "The distinguishing mark of a manifestly illegal order," the judge ruled, "is that above such an order should fly like a black flag, a warning saying prohibited." That ruling, incidentally, was later cited by another Israeli court, the one that tried Adolf Eichmann. It affirmed a principle the Western world was understandably eager to champion in the aftermath of World War II and the Nuremberg trials, that soldiers cannot simply defer responsibility to their superiors when given blatantly unjust orders, that being instructed to commit a flagrant atrocity doesn't excuse doing so, even if we agree that the greatest blame belongs to those higher up in the chain of command. How should we label the acts of the soldiers who refused to obey the order to shoot the curfew violators? Some people would say we should call them acts of goodness or compassion, simple acts of human decency, in other words. But I don't think this illuminates much. It doesn't illuminate much because exhibiting compassion when there is no risk of offending the authorities, when it comes at no cost to oneself, is fairly easy. It's also fairly ubiquitous. We can all be compassionate to our friends, to our fellow soldiers, in situations where it is socially approved. But what about extending compassion to the enemy, to villagers who are different from us, when the authorities and our fellow citizens may not approve? This is much harder and requires something more than mere goodness. What it requires is moral courage, the courage to stand by a value or principle when it is risky and inconvenient, when doing so could cost you your reputation, the approval of others, your career, in extreme cases, even your life. How does moral courage differ from other forms of courage? I thought about this a lot when writing my book, Beautiful Souls, never more so than when composing the section about this person. That is a picture of Abner Wischnitzer, the subject of chapter 3 of my book. As those of you who have read it know, Abner grew up on a kibbutz in central Israel, deeply patriotic, dreaming of serving his country by becoming a soldier, which he feared he wouldn't be able to do because he was too skinny, too interested in books, too meek. At age 14, Abner poked his head into the recreation room at the kibbutz and watched a martial arts class that was taking place. The martial art was Taekwondo, which Abner soon began to practice with fierce determination, in the hope of shedding his meekness. 3 years later, at age 17, he was anointed the junior national Taekwondo champion in his weight class. A year after that, Abner was conscripted to serve in the Israeli army, and after making it through a highly selective battery of tests, entered the ranks of Sayeret Matkal, the most elite commando unit in Israel. Serving in this unit was the ultimate validation of Abner's toughness, his manhood, his courage. Or so he thought, until a year or so after he'd finished serving in the army, he went to a lecture that his sister invited him to attend. At that lecture, Abner saw images of Palestinian shepherds and farmers being harassed and mistreated by Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. Their farmland burned, their water wells poisoned, their crops destroyed. Abner was sufficiently unnerved that after the lecture, he decided to visit this place in the occupied territories. From that point on, he started going to the territories more regularly, and the more he saw and learned about the degrading conditions Palestinians lived under, the more disillusioned he became. Eventually, in 2003, at the height of the Second Intifada, after being ordered to serve in Operation Defensive Shield, a massive incursion into the West Bank, ordered by then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Abner called the commander of his unit, who he regarded as a father figure, to tell him that he could not bring himself to serve in the operation, or any operation in the occupied territories. He was joining the ranks of refuseniks, the Israeli term for conscientious objectors. Soon after placing that call, Abner was kicked out of his unit. After a story aired on Israeli television identifying him by name, he was denounced and vilified as a traitor, as a coward, as a yafeh nefesh, the Hebrew term for beautiful soul, which in Israel connotes being too pure, a bleeding heart. It is not a compliment, but an insult. So how, in Abner's mind, did the courage not to serve, to refuse, differ from the courage to serve? It was 10 times scarier, he told me, because when he was in the army, even when he was taking enormous risks, which he did, Abner knew his society was behind him. Haruach haya bagav, he said, Hebrew for the wind was at my back. When he refused, by contrast, the wind was in his face, and its force completely upended him. Given how unnerving this can be, why would anyone do it? What sets people who display moral courage apart? As those of you who have read my book know, I don't have a magic formula to answer this. There is something mysterious and ineffable about every such act, which is why I think many of us find the people who carry them out so fascinating. My book begins with a quote from Susan Sontag, quote, "At the center of our moral life and our moral imaginations are the great models of resistance, the great stories of those who have said no." They are great stories in part because there is something mysterious about them. That said, I do think we can draw some conclusions about what people who display moral courage in difficult circumstances generally are and are not. One thing they're not is figures of angelic virtue, as some of the literature on Holocaust rescuers, the so-called righteous among nations, suggests. In some of the more honey-coated contributions to this literature, what we get are sanctimonious portraits of saints. More often than not, which the more sophisticated literature points out, these portraits are exaggerated or fanciful. Oskar Schindler, who saved hundreds of Jews during World War II and was a manipulator, a womanizer, and a briber, was not a saint. Alexander Yevtich, a Serb I wrote about in the second chapter of my book, who risked his life to save Croats in the middle of the Balkan Wars of the early 1990s, in an act of extraordinary courage that could have cost him his life, is anything but a saint, as he would be the first to tell you. Individuals who display moral courage can be bullheaded, they can be short-sighted, they can be reckless, they can also be disarmingly ordinary. We do them no favors by pretending otherwise. Indeed, the impulse to gloss over their flaws may be rooted in a less noble impulse. If we think only people of unqualified virtue can display moral courage, after all, we sort of let the rest of humanity off the hook. We relieve ourselves of even attempting to emulate their example. None of the people I wrote about in my book are saints, nor are any of them rebels who, from an early age, were pining to break ranks. This may sound strange, since displaying moral courage invariably requires undertaking a rebellious act, defying one's superiors, blowing the whistle, saying no. But think of Abner Wishnitzer. He didn't grow up wanting to rebel against his society and the Israeli army. He grew up desperately wanting to serve in an army he believed was exactly what the Israeli military claims to be, the most moral army in the world, as new recruits are all told. Abner was not a rebel, but a true believer. And this idealism was, ironically, one of the reasons he ended up becoming a refusenik. How could the most moral army in the world allow itself to be tarnished and corrupted by a brutal military occupation? He kept asking himself. A similar streak of idealism was evident in the other people I wrote about, among them Layla Weidler, a broker who blew the whistle on a massive act of financial fraud in this country. Originally from El Salvador, Weidler didn't enter her profession with a cynical view of the American financial system. She entered it believing it was a system where, unlike in Latin America, corruption and fraud would not be tolerated, which is why she was sure the SEC would investigate the claims she reported about her company. Transparency, due diligence, Weidler believed unswervingly in these principles. Like Abner, her identification with the system, her investment in these principles, and her desire to see them honored is what ultimately led her to blow the whistle on an institution that was violating, an institution that happened to be her employer, at least until she blew the whistle. Now, I don't want to overstate the case about idealism and true believers. There certainly are idealists out there, true believers, who become dutiful conformists rather than principled nonconformists. Adolf Eichmann, a committed Nazi who firmly believed in the ideology of Nazism, was one such person. Beyond being idealists, there is another quality that distinguishes the dissenters I wrote about: the ability to consider things from the perspective of others. More specifically, from the perspective of the people whose lives they have been conditioned to dismiss and discount. This is what Alexander Yevtich did when, in defiance of his fellow Serbs, he acted to protect a group of Croats trapped in a Serbian detention facility at a time when Serbs and Croats in the former Yugoslavia were at war, a war that destroyed his own hometown. It is what Abner Wischnitzer did when, in the middle of the Second Intifada, when a wave of suicide bombings led most Israelis to cut off sympathy for Palestinians, he refused to serve in a mission he believed would victimize them. What Avner and Acho exercised at these moments was their moral imaginations, a faculty the philosopher and economist Adam Smith described in a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was published more than 250 years ago in 1759. Among economists today, Smith is best known for his writings about laissez-faire capitalism, in particular his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. But in his own lifetime, Smith was better known for the theory of moral sentiments, which begins with a rumination on what makes human beings feel discomfort when they see someone suffering, a person being tortured on the rack. However selfish man may be supposed, Smith wrote in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it, except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. Quote. Now, let's not be naive. As the past century has repeatedly shown, the human imagination can lead people to behave cruelly and callously. Under the influence of fear, under the sway of prejudice, when the imagination is inflamed by the kind of group hatred that crystallized in Rwanda in 1994, when Hutus were encouraged to think of Tutsis as their enemies, to imagine them as subhuman, as cockroaches, and to exterminate them. This is how the genocide that led to the slaughter of nearly 1 million Rwandans was unleashed. But even then, at the height of the slaughter in Rwanda, at the peak of the ethnic cleansing and mass atrocities that engulfed the Balkans in the early 1990s, there were some people who did not allow themselves to imagine this, who instead imagined what it would be like to be among the victims. The dissenters in my book all use their moral imaginations in this other transgressive way, to extend sympathy to outsiders, to people under threat, to people whose interests they have been encouraged to keep out of mind. Being true believers, exercising their moral imaginations, these are two of the qualities the people I wrote about shared. A third shared trait is a willingness to assume responsibility for the consequences of their actions. This may sound like a fairly simple thing to do. In fact, in the modern world, it is all too easy not to assume responsibility for the consequences of our actions. One reason for this is that many of us don't see the consequences. thanks to technology or the choices we make, we remain distant from the people who are affected by our actions. Another is that many of us end up working in large bureaucratic institutions where, if something goes awry, it's easy to pin the blame on someone else. The boss who told you to do it, the subordinate who carried it out. This is the essence of modern bureaucracy, where the tasks are cut up and subdivided in a way that the individual can easily shift responsibility to someone else when things go wrong. In a world governed by large impersonal forces, where the link between cause and effect is increasingly unclear, resisting this temptation, as this person did, is not easy. It is a choice. We all recognize this person. Edward Snowden. As Edward Snowden's story usefully reminds us, those who make such choices, particularly when it may embarrass their own government, are easier to approve of from a distance after the fact than up close. We can see this in the profusion of harshly disapproving editorials and essays that have been written about Snowden in the past year or two, characterizing him as, quote, a grandiose narcissist who deserves to be in prison. Jeffrey Toobin, The New Yorker. A person completely oblivious to his betrayals and the damage he has done. David Brooks, The New York Times. A dupe and a tool. Fred Kaplan, Slate. Kaplan began his piece in Slate by comparing Snowden to another famous American whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, the former military analyst who, in 1971, released the top-secret Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and other newspapers, thus exposing the lies that various administrations had told the American people about the Vietnam War. I regard Daniel Ellsberg as an American patriot, Kaplan wrote in the first sentence of his article, before going on to explain why Edward Snowden is anything but a patriot. It's possible, of course, that Kaplan and others who share this view simply believe Ellsberg behaved more responsibly than Snowden, and that the lies he exposed were far more serious. But it's also worth noting that 4 decades after the fact, it's fairly easy to regard Daniel Ellsberg as a patriot. It was rather different in 1971, when the Vietnam War was raging, and many Americans denounced Ellsberg as a traitor for divulging secrets that embarrassed the US government and bolstered the morale of America's enemies. At the time, as Taylor Branch notes in a book about whistleblowers that was published in 1972, even many of his dovish friends who opposed the Vietnam War believed that Daniel Ellsberg was crazy. The debate about Ellsberg was actually not so different from the debate today about Snowden, who, I would hasten to guess, will be viewed differently and probably more favorably 20 or 30 years from now. Now, admittedly, it is a lot easier to admire people who blow the whistle or engage in acts of principled non-cooperation when we share their principles. When we agree, in the case of Snowden, that mass surveillance is a grave threat to democracy, and that this justifies releasing classified information. But what if we don't agree with this? To take it one step further, what are we to make of individuals who take a risky and courageous stand for a principle we find abhorrent? How do we distinguish their conduct from the acts of people who take courageous stands for principles that we admire? In my book, I try to grapple with this question by writing about another group of refuseniks that has emerged in Israel in recent years. Religious soldiers who disobey orders not because they oppose the occupation of Palestinian land, but because they support it, since they view it as Jewish land. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, which was then occupied. In the process, ordering the army to dismantle all the Jewish settlements that had been built there illegally and to evacuate all the people living in those settlements. During the disengagement, 95 Israeli soldiers were punished for disobeying this order. Most of them religious soldiers who believed that Jews have a biblical injunction to settle the land in Gaza in accordance with God's command. Quote, "A Jew does not evacuate a Jew," one of the soldiers arrested during the disengagement proclaimed. His name was Avi Bieber, American-born, and when I interviewed him, he cited the importance of consulting his conscience rather than obeying orders or following the law. To this day, Bieber is regarded as a hero by many Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Can we deny that what Bieber did took courage? Although I could not disagree more strongly with his view of the Gaza disengagement, I don't think we can deny this. I also don't think we can deny that he followed the dictates of his conscience, the inner voice that individuals consult when they refuse to obey a law or order based on deeply held personal convictions. In this country, during the civil rights movement, some men and women of conscience engaged in sit-ins at segregated lunch counters so that equal rights could be extended to African Americans. Others defied federal orders so that the privileged place of white Americans would be preserved in the segregated South. Both said no to a situation they regarded as unconscionable after consulting their consciences. Measured by the depth and sincerity of their convictions, perhaps there is little difference between the people who carried out these acts. Measured by moral content, there clearly is a difference. One way to draw it out, it seems to me, is to examine how much, or how little, those who say no have stretched their moral imaginations to extend sympathy to people who are different than them, to the other. Refuseniks in Israel who disobey orders that harm and humiliate Palestinians have clearly made this imaginative leap. Right-wing refuseniks like Avi Bieber have not. The humiliation of Palestinians does not weigh on their consciences, only the perceived humiliation of their fellow Jews, which they feel very acutely, just as the disgraceful treatment of African Americans in the segregated South prompted no reflection or remorse among white Southerners who defiantly opposed efforts to end segregation in the 1960s. The fact that conscience is so personal and subjective is one reason those who act in its name often spark controversy. An additional source of controversy concerns the goal of such acts. Is the goal to bring about social justice and create a better society, as Edward Snowden would claim? Or is it merely to make the individual feel better about himself? In the view of the philosopher Hugo Adam Bideau, quote in my book, it is the latter. The primary aim of conscientious objection, he argues, is, quote, not public education, but private exemption. Not public change, but, to put it bluntly, personal hand-washing. Hannah Arendt articulated a similar view. Conscience, she wrote, quote, is not primarily interested in the world where the wrong is committed, or in the consequences that the wrong will have for the future course of the world. It does not say with Jefferson, I tremble for my country, because it trembles for the individual self and its integrity. End quote. The person in the next slide would seem to agree. That, of course, is Henry David Thoreau, author of On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, an essay Thoreau composed shortly after he was jailed for refusing to pay his taxes. As many of you know, Thoreau refused to pay them because he didn't want to lend his support to a government that tolerated slavery and that was fighting what he regarded as an unjust war in Mexico. This would appear to be an act carried out to transform society. But that is not what Thoreau himself said. Quote, "It is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous, wrong," he wrote in his famous essay. "He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it, and if he gives it no thought longer, not to give it practically his support." This is the creed of what Arendt called the good man, who thinks only about his own moral purity, as opposed to the good citizen, who thinks about the well-being of society and is therefore willing to make compromises, so that society as a whole benefits. Is Arendt justified in her criticism of the good man, the man or woman of conscience? If you read my book, you'll see that I believe she is half justified. It's true enough that some acts of conscience are carried out merely to preserve the integrity and purity of the individual, and that these acts sometimes do little to address the larger injustice taking place. Think of an Israeli soldier who is ordered to raid the home of a Palestinian family in the occupied territories. He doesn't want to dirty his hands in such an operation. He thinks it's unconscionable. So he tells his commander how he feels. And the commander quietly excuses him, assigning him to sit at a desk. The soldier sits at his desk, feeling much better about himself, and the raid goes forward as planned, with a different soldier taking his place, a soldier who feels no moral qualms about the operation, and maybe, for this reason, carries it out more brutally. Had Abner Wischnitzer merely done something like this, quietly excused himself so he could sleep better at night, he would have fit the description of the good man that Arendt somewhat derisively describes. But Abner didn't merely do this. In addition to calling his commander, he also aired his views publicly in a letter to Israeli Prime Minister Sharon. This was an act of personal hand-washing and an act of public education. And Abner didn't stop there. He has continued to protest, to refuse, to air his views publicly about the injustice of the occupation, as he sees it, through an organization called Combatants for Peace, a group of ex-Israeli and Palestinian fighters who have put their guns down and are now trying to convince their fellow citizens to do the same. What does this tell us? What it tells us, for one thing, is that the line between the good man and the good citizen isn't always so clear. The person who feels compelled to wash his or her hands of a wrong may also, later, feel compelled to eradicate that wrong, as happened in Abner's case. The other thing it tells us is that the question of responsibility on such occasions doesn't stop with individual dissenters. For whatever their aims may be, these individuals can't possibly transform society on their own. Their power ultimately depends on the rest of us, on whether we choose to pay attention to them, on whether we are willing to look past the labels traitor, beautiful soul, sometimes used to dismiss them. On whether, if we agree they might have had good reason to act, we may be willing to join them or try to change the unconscionable situation that led them to break ranks in other ways. Near the end of my book, I quote a military lawyer named Daryl Vandeveld, who was the lead prosecutor of the detainees in Guantanamo, until he experienced a crisis of conscience and became one of the more outspoken critics of the Bush administration's detention and interrogation program. An individual dissenter cannot change society, Vandeveld told me. The only impact he can have is to bring pain on himself. As I go on to argue, this is true only to the extent that the individuals who undertake such acts remain isolated and unheard. Ensuring they are not isolated and unheard is a responsibility that all good citizens, and for that matter, good men, must share. Thank you.